Picture this. A seasoned Air Force veteran turned vice principal, standing in a crowded school courtyard as three entitled football players attempt to humiliate her in the most degrading way possible, lifting her skirt in front of hundreds of students with their phones out, recording what they think will be their greatest prank yet. What these bullies didn't know was that Dr. Elena Martinez had spent 8 years in military security, trained in combat techniques they couldn't even pronounce, and possessed a steel resolve forged in places far more dangerous than any high school hallway. In the next 60 seconds, these cocky teenagers would learn why you should never, ever underestimate the quiet strength of a woman who's faced down real threats in real wars. By the time she was done with them, they'd be on their knees begging, not just for mercy, but for the chance to undo the biggest mistake of their privileged lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Millbrook, Colorado, as Dr. Elena Martinez pulled her silver Honda into the faculty parking lot of Riverside High School. October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of marching band practice echoed across the sprawling campus. Elena sat for a moment in her car, watching students stream through the main entrance, their voices creating a familiar symphony of teenage energy and drama that she'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 months. At 34, Elena possessed the kind of understated presence that often caused people to overlook her until it was too late. Standing 5 feet 6 inches with shoulder-length dark hair, usually pulled back in a professional bun, she favored conservative blazers and modest skirts that spoke of administrative authority rather than personal style. Her brown eyes held depths that hinted at experiences far beyond the suburban Colorado landscape, though few at Riverside High had bothered to look closely enough to notice. To most students and even some faculty, she was simply the new vice principal who'd replaced the beloved Mr. Thompson after his retirement, another administrative figure to be tolerated rather than respected. What they didn't know, what wasn't listed on her resume or mentioned in the staff meetings, was that Dr. Elena Martinez had spent 8 years in the United States Air Force Security Forces. She'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, where she'd learned to read threats in the shifting shadows of cobbled streets and respond to danger with the kind of calculated precision that kept people alive. After her military service, she'd transitioned into corporate security, spending 5 years protecting executives and managing crisis situations for a Fortune 500 company. The transition to education had been deliberate, driven by a desire to serve her community in a different way, to use her skills in an environment where the stakes were measured in futures shaped rather than lives saved. Elena gathered her briefcase and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The campus of Riverside High sprawled before her like a small college, complete with multiple buildings, a championship football stadium, and perfectly manicured grounds that spoke to the wealth of Millbrook's tax base. This wasn't an inner-city school struggling with resources or urban problems. This was suburban privilege at its finest, where the biggest concerns were supposed to be college applications and prom themes, not the kind of systematic intimidation and entitled behavior that had been reported to her office with increasing frequency. The administrative building stood at the heart of the campus, its modern glass and brick facade gleaming in the morning sun. Elena's office was located on the 2nd floor, down a carpeted hallway lined with portraits of distinguished alumni and championship trophies that dated back decades. She'd spent countless hours in that office over the past 3 months, reviewing discipline reports, meeting with concerned parents, and trying to understand the complex social dynamics that governed Riverside High's student body. What she'd discovered troubled her more than she'd initially let on. Beneath the veneer of academic excellence and athletic achievement, there existed a culture of unchecked privilege that had allowed certain students to operate with virtual impunity. At the center of this culture stood Tyler Bennett, a 17-year-old senior who quarterbacked the football team with the same casual arrogance he brought to every other aspect of his life. Tyler wasn't just popular, he was untouchable, protected by a combination of athletic talent, family wealth, and a school administration that had historically chosen to look the other way when star athletes bent the rules. Elena had been hired specifically to address these discipline issues, brought in by a school board that was growing concerned about liability and public perception. Principal Robert Chen, a well-meaning man in his 50s who'd climbed the administrative ladder through decades of conflict avoidance, had briefed her extensively about the challenge Tyler presented. The boy's father, James Bennett, was not only a major donor to the school's athletic programs, but also a prominent local businessman whose construction company had built half the developments in Millbrook. When Tyler got into trouble, which happened with predictable regularity, a combination of parental pressure and administrative convenience ensured that consequences were minimal and documentation sparse. The pattern had continued for years. Teachers who tried to hold Tyler accountable found themselves transferred to less desirable positions. Coaches who attempted to bench him for behavior issues discovered their contracts weren't renewed. Students who complained about his treatment found their concerns dismissed or, worse, turned back on them as discipline problems of their own. It was a system designed to protect the golden boy, and it had worked flawlessly until Elena's arrival. She'd spent her first month observing, taking careful notes, and building relationships with faculty members who were willing to speak honestly about the situation. What emerged was a picture of systematic bullying that went far beyond typical teenage meanness. Tyler and his inner circle had turned harassment into an art form, using social media, peer pressure, and carefully calculated public humiliation to maintain their position at the top of Riverside's social hierarchy. They were smart about it, never crossing lines that would result in automatic suspension, always operating in gray areas where their actions could be dismissed as pranks or teenage drama. But Elena had seen real predators in action, had dealt with individuals whose capacity for cruelty was measured in body counts rather than hurt feelings. She recognized the signs of systematic abuse, understood how power dynamics could corrupt even seemingly harmless environments. What Tyler and his friends were doing wasn't harmless teenage behavior. It was a training ground for the kind of entitled cruelty that, left unchecked, would follow them into adulthood and poison every environment they entered. The first incident report that had crossed her desk involved a freshman named David Kim, a quiet boy whose only crime had been excelling in honors classes that Tyler struggled with. The harassment had been subtle at first. Textbooks knocked from desks, lunch money that mysteriously disappeared, social media posts that tagged David in humiliating memes. When David finally worked up the courage to report the incidents, he'd been told by the previous administration that boys would be boys, and perhaps he should focus on fitting in better rather than making waves. Elena had called David into her office personally, spending nearly an hour listening to his story and taking detailed notes. She'd seen the same haunted look in his eyes that she'd recognized in the faces of Afghan interpreters who'd been threatened by Taliban forces. The expression of someone who knew they were being hunted but had nowhere safe to run. That meeting had crystallized her understanding of what she was really dealing with at Riverside High. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This wasn't about teenage drama or social hierarchies. This was about power and the corruption that came when that power went unchecked. The second incident had involved Amy Walsh, a sophomore whose artistic talents had earned her recognition. In a statewide competition, Tyler's girlfriend, Madison Cole, had taken exception to the attention Amy received, viewing it as a threat to her own carefully cultivated image as Riverside's premier creative talent. The campaign against Amy had been vicious and coordinated, her artwork vandalized, her social media accounts flooded with hateful comments, her few friends pressured to distance themselves or face similar treatment. When Amy's parents had demanded action, they'd been told that cyberbullying was difficult to prove and that teenage girls were naturally dramatic about social conflicts. Elena had spent hours reviewing the digital evidence, tracing IP addresses and social media connections with the kind of methodical precision she'd learned tracking insurgent communication networks in Afghanistan. The pattern was clear and unmistakable. A coordinated campaign of harassment designed to isolate and intimidate a perceived threat. She documented everything, built an airtight case, and presented it to Principal Chen with a recommendation for immediate suspension and mandatory counseling for all involved parties. The response had been predictable. James Bennett had arrived at the school within hours, accompanied by the family's attorney and armed with veiled threats about lawsuit and negative publicity. Madison's parents, equally prominent members of Millbrook's social elite, had presented their own legal representation and character witnesses who testified to their daughter's outstanding moral character. Principal Chen, caught between Eleanor's documented evidence and the kind of pressure he'd spent his career learning to avoid, had opted for compromise, mandatory community service and counseling that could be completed privately, with no formal discipline records that might affect college applications. It was then that Elena had realized she was fighting more than just entitled teenagers. She was confronting an entire system that had been designed to protect and enable their behavior. A network of adults who had invested too much in maintaining the status quo to allow real change. The realization had been both disappointing and familiar. She'd seen similar corruption in military and corporate environments, understood how institutional momentum could override individual integrity when the stakes were high enough. But Elena Martinez hadn't survived 8 years in the Air Force security forces by backing down from difficult fights. She'd learned patience in environments where hasty action could get people killed, developed strategic thinking in situations where every decision carried life or death consequences. If the system wouldn't change from the top down, she'd create pressure from the bottom up. If documentation and proper procedures weren't enough to ensure accountability, she'd find other ways to protect the students under her care. The third incident had been the turning point. Sarah Kim, a senior honor student and younger sister to David, had been selected as valedictorian based on her exceptional academic record and community service. Tyler, whose own grades had been artificially inflated through a combination of athletic accommodation and parental pressure, had expected the honor to go to him as part of his college recruitment package. When the selection was announced, Tyler's response had been swift and brutal. Sarah's car had been vandalized in the school parking lot, her tires slashed and offensive graffiti spray-painted across the windshield. Her locker had been broken into and filled with rotting food. Most viciously, compromising photos that had been digitally manipulated to include her face had been circulated throughout the school's social media networks. The campaign had been designed not just to humiliate Sarah, but to destroy her reputation so thoroughly that her academic achievements would be overshadowed by manufactured scandal. Elena had investigated the incident with the kind of thoroughness that had once helped her identify security threats to high-value military targets. She'd spent days reviewing security footage, analyzing digital evidence, and interviewing witnesses who were willing to speak privately but afraid to go on record. The case she built was ironclad. Tyler and his friends had orchestrated every aspect of the harassment campaign, using their social media influence and network of followers to amplify the damage while maintaining plausible deniability about their direct involvement. When she presented her findings to Principal Chen, accompanied by a formal recommendation for immediate expulsion and criminal charges for cyberbullying and harassment, Elena had expected resistance. What she hadn't anticipated was the speed and coordination of the response. Within hours, she'd been called to an emergency meeting with Chen, the superintendent, and 2 school board members. James Bennett and his attorney had been present, along with a private investigator who'd apparently been hired to examine Elena's own background for any information that might undermine her credibility. The message had been clear without being explicitly stated. Drop the investigation or face consequences that would extend far beyond her position at Riverside High. Elena had been reminded of her probationary status as a new administrator, informed about budget constraints that might necessitate personnel reductions, and warned about the importance of maintaining positive relationships with community stakeholders. The subtext had been unmistakable. Tyler Bennett was off limits, protected by forces that extended far beyond the school's administrative structure. That night, Elena had sat in her small apartment overlooking Millbrook's downtown area, thinking about the choice she faced. She could fall in line, accept the limitations of her position, and content herself with protecting students in ways that didn't threaten the established order. She could document incidents without pursuing real consequences, provide counseling and support, while knowing that the root causes of the problem would remain untouched. It would be the safe choice, the professional choice, the kind of pragmatic decision that preserved careers and avoided unnecessary conflict. But as she looked at the files spread across her coffee table, filled with incident reports and victim statements and evidence of systematic cruelty, Elena had remembered why she'd transitioned from corporate security to education in the first place. She'd wanted to make a difference in young people's lives, to use her skills and experience in service of something larger than profit margins and shareholder value. The students at Riverside High deserved better than adults who were willing to sacrifice their safety and dignity for the sake of political convenience and financial contribution. The decision had crystallized in that moment. If the system wouldn't protect students like David and Amy and Sarah, then Elena would find other ways to fulfill her responsibility. She'd spent years learning to adapt to hostile environments, to find creative solutions when conventional approaches failed. Tyler Bennett and his friends had operated without real opposition for too long, grown careless in their assumption that their protection was absolute. But protection had limits, especially when it came into conflict with someone who understood how power really worked and wasn't afraid to challenge it directly. The next morning, Elena had returned to Riverside High with a new sense of purpose. She'd continued her official duties with the same professional competence that had marked her first 3 months, but she'd also begun a more subtle campaign of her own. She'd started building relationships with students who'd been targeted by Tyler's group, creating safe spaces for them to share their experiences and document ongoing incidents. She'd worked with sympathetic faculty members to identify patterns of behavior that might not trigger formal discipline procedures, but still created hostile learning environments. Most importantly, she'd begun studying Tyler and his inner circle, with the same methodical attention she'd once devoted to understanding insurgent networks and corporate security threats. She learned their schedules, their habits, their weaknesses, and their blind spots. She monitored their social media activities, tracked their academic performance, and documented their interactions with other students. She wasn't looking for a single dramatic confrontation. She was preparing for the kind of strategic campaign that would systematically undermine their ability to operate with impunity. Elena understood that Tyler's power came from perception as much as reality. He maintained control through carefully cultivated image of invincibility, the belief among students and faculty that challenging him was futile and potentially dangerous. But images could be shattered, especially when they were built on foundations as unstable as teenage ego and parental protection. All it would take was the right moment, the right circumstances, and the right response to show everyone at Riverside that Tyler Bennett wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. As October progressed and homecoming week approached, Elena sensed that moment drawing closer. Tyler's behavior had grown more brazen as he'd realized that his previous tactics for neutralizing administrative threats weren't working with her. He'd begun testing boundaries more directly, engaging in increasingly provocative behavior that seemed designed to force a confrontation. His friends had followed his lead, emboldened by their leader's apparent confidence that he could handle whatever consequences might arise. Elena watched it all with the patience of someone who'd learned to wait for the right opportunity to present itself. She'd faced more dangerous opponents than entitled teenagers in environments far more hostile than suburban high schools. When the moment came, she'd be ready to respond with the kind of decisive action that would change the power dynamic at Riverside High permanently. Tyler Bennett and his friends had no idea what they were dealing with, but they were about to learn that some people couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bought, and couldn't be broken by the kind of pressure they were accustomed to applying. The morning sun climbed higher over Millbrook as Elena walked through Riverside High's main entrance, nodding to students and faculty with the same professional demeanor she'd maintained since her arrival. But beneath that calm exterior, she carried the coiled readiness of someone who'd spent years preparing for moments when everything could change in an instant. Today felt different somehow, charged with the kind of tension that preceded significant events. Tyler and his friends had been planning something. She'd seen it in their whispered conversations, their knowing glances, their barely contained excitement about whatever scheme they'd devised. Elena settled into her office, reviewed her schedule, and prepared for whatever the day might bring. She'd learned long ago that the best way to handle unpredictable situations was to remain calm, stay alert, and trust in the training and experience that had carried her through far more dangerous circumstances. Whatever Tyler Bennett thought he had planned for her, he was about to discover that Dr. Elena Martinez wasn't just another administrator who could be intimidated into submission. She was a warrior who'd chosen to fight her battles in classrooms and hallways rather than foreign battlefields, but a warrior nonetheless. The stage was set. The players were in position, and somewhere in the corridors of Riverside High, a confrontation was building that would change everything for everyone involved. Elena's investigation into Riverside High's social ecosystem began, the way all good intelligence gathering did, with careful observation and systematic documentation. During her second week at the school, she'd established what she privately called her morning reconnaissance, arriving 30 minutes before the official start of the school day to observe student interactions in their most natural state. Without the structure of classes and adult supervision, the hallways became a laboratory where she could study the unfiltered dynamics that governed teenage life at Riverside. The main courtyard served as the school's unofficial social headquarters, a sprawling concrete plaza surrounded by oak trees and dotted with picnic tables where different groups claimed their territories with the precision of military units establishing defensive positions. Elena positioned herself at her office window on the second floor, where she had a clear view of the entire area while remaining invisible to the students below. Through careful observation, she'd mapped the social geography, with the same attention to detail she'd once used to analyze patrol routes in hostile territory. The northeastern corner belonged to the academic elite, students whose college-bound conversations about SAT scores and scholarship applications created an invisible barrier around their claimed space. These were the kids who would populate the honor roll announcements and fill the slots at prestigious universities, their futures as carefully planned as military campaigns. Elena recognized several faces from the academic achievement photos that lined the administrative hallway. Young people whose intelligence and ambition should have made them natural leaders, but who instead seemed to exist in a state of cautious neutrality, avoiding any behavior that might draw unwanted attention from more volatile social groups. The southwestern section had been claimed by what Elena mentally categorized as the creative faction: art students, drama club members, and the handful of teenagers who dressed in ways that marked them as deliberately different from Riverside's mainstream culture. These students carried sketch pads and instrument cases, their conversations punctuated by references to bands Elena had never heard of, and artistic movements that seemed to exist in conscious opposition to everything their suburban environment represented. They were the ones most likely to challenge conventional thinking, but also the most vulnerable to retaliation from peers who viewed nonconformity as a personal threat. But it was the central area of the courtyard that drew Elena's most focused attention. This prime real estate, with its optimal sunlight and proximity to multiple building entrances, belonged unquestionably to Tyler Bennett and his inner circle. The group occupied their space with the casual confidence of people who'd never had their right to exist questioned, their body language radiating the kind of entitlement that came from years of positive reinforcement and minimal consequences. Tyler himself was exactly what central casting would order for the role of high school golden boy. At 6 feet 2 inches, with the broad shoulders and lean muscle mass of a dedicated athlete, he moved through the world with the easy grace of someone accustomed to physical dominance. His sandy brown hair was expertly styled in a way that appeared effortless, but probably required considerable time and expensive products. And his green eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that made his casual cruelty even more disturbing. This wasn't mindless brutality driven by insecurity or ignorance. Tyler's actions were calculated and deliberate, the product of a mind that understood exactly how to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Marcus Rivera, Tyler's closest friend and most reliable accomplice, served as the group's enforcer and social media specialist. Where Tyler preferred to maintain a veneer of sophisticated superiority, Marcus embraced a more openly aggressive approach to establishing dominance. He was the one who filmed the group's various pranks and humiliations, turning cruelty into content for their extensive social media following. Elena had spent hours analyzing Marcus's various accounts, noting how he'd perfected the art of documenting harassment while framing it as harmless entertainment. His followers, numbering in the thousands thanks to his association with Tyler's athletic fame, provided a ready audience for whatever content the group produced. Jackson Hayes represented the group's connection to Riverside's broader social media ecosystem. Tall and lean, with carefully cultivated stubble and an extensive collection of expensive streetwear, Jackson had built a personal brand around lifestyle, content that showcased the privileges of upper-middle-class suburban life. His Instagram feed was a carefully curated gallery of luxury cars, exclusive parties, and branded merchandise that created an aspirational image other students desperately wanted to access. Elena had identified Jackson as the group's most sophisticated operator, someone who understood how to weaponize social influence in ways that were both devastating and difficult to trace back to their source. The female members of Tyler's inner circle operated with a different but equally effective form of social violence. Madison Cole, Tyler's girlfriend and the undisputed queen of Riverside's social hierarchy, possessed the kind of conventional beauty that came from excellent genetics, professional maintenance, and unlimited access to the fashion and cosmetics that defined teenage femininity. Her long blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her makeup flawlessly applied, and her wardrobe a rotating display of designer labels that most students could only dream of affording. But beneath Madison's Instagram-perfect exterior lay a strategic mind that understood exactly how to destroy reputations and social standing through carefully orchestrated campaigns of exclusion and humiliation. Kaylee Ross served as Madison's lieutenant and primary information gatherer, a role that perfectly suited her talent for extracting secrets and spreading rumors with surgical precision. Where Madison operated from a position of established authority, Kaylee worked the margins, cultivating relationships with students from different social groups and using those connections to gather intelligence that could be weaponized when necessary. Elena had observed Kaylee's technique during lunch periods, watching how she would engage seemingly random students in friendly conversation before smoothly extracting personal information that would later be used to devastating effect. The group's power extended far beyond their immediate membership through a network of followers, wannabes, and students who'd been intimidated into compliance. Elena had identified at least 30 students who regularly participated in the group's activities, either by actively supporting their various campaigns or by remaining silent when they witnessed harassment taking place. This larger network created an atmosphere of surveillance and enforcement that made resistance seem futile and potentially dangerous. But it was the adults who enabled Tyler's behavior that truly disturbed Elena. During her morning observations, she'd watched how faculty members interacted with the group, noting the subtle deference that even experienced teachers showed when dealing with Tyler and his friends. Coach Williams, the head football coach, whose job security depended entirely on the team's performance, treated Tyler with the kind of respect usually reserved for professional colleagues rather than student athletes. Elena had observed several interactions where Tyler openly contradicted the coach's instructions without facing any consequences, his status as the team's star quarterback apparently granting him authority that transcended normal hierarchical relationships. Even more troubling was the behavior of teachers who should have been immune to athletic politics. Mrs. Henderson, who taught advanced placement English and prided herself on maintaining high academic standards, consistently gave Tyler extensions and accommodations that she denied to other students. Elena had reviewed grade records and discovered a pattern of inflated scores and modified assignments that bore no relationship to Tyler's actual academic performance. When she'd raised the issue with Mrs. Henderson during a private meeting, the teacher had become defensive and evasive, eventually admitting that she'd been encouraged by the administration to be flexible with student athletes who faced demanding schedules. The guidance counselor, Mr. Patterson, had proven even more compromised. Elena's review of disciplinary records revealed that Patterson routinely minimized incidents involving Tyler and his friends, reframing harassment and bullying as social conflicts that could be resolved through mediation and understanding. When victims reported systematic abuse, Patterson often suggested that they might be misinterpreting their peers' intentions or that they should focus on building resilience rather than seeking accountability for the students who were tormenting them. Elena had requested a meeting with Patterson to discuss his approach to discipline, but he'd cancelled twice and eventually stopped responding to her requests entirely. Most disturbing of all was Principal Chen's obvious discomfort whenever Tyler's behavior became a topic of discussion. During their weekly administrative meetings, Chen would consistently steer conversations away from discipline issues involving high-profile students, preferring to focus on policy matters and bureaucratic procedures that allowed him to avoid making difficult decisions. Elena had quickly realized that Chen's approach to leadership was based on conflict avoidance and consensus building, strategies that worked well in most educational environments, but proved disastrous when dealing with students who interpreted administrative hesitation as permission to escalate their behavior. The research Elena conducted into Tyler's family background revealed the source of his apparent immunity from consequences. James Bennett wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a political power broker whose influence extended throughout Millbrook's civic and educational infrastructure. His construction company had built not only residential developments, but also several major additions to Riverside High, including the state-of-the-art athletic facilities that had helped establish the school's reputation for excellence in sports. More significantly, James served on the school board's facilities committee and had personally funded scholarship programs that bore the Bennett family name. Tyler's mother, Patricia Bennett, wielded influence through different channels, but with equal effectiveness. As president of the Riverside Booster Club and chairman of the annual fundraising gala, she controlled access to the social networks that determined which families were accepted into Millbrook's elite circles. Elena had discovered that Patricia maintained detailed files on other families, tracking everything from financial difficulties to marital problems to teenage indiscretions that could be leveraged when necessary. Teachers and administrators who crossed the Bennett family often found themselves excluded from social events, passed over for promotions, or facing whisper campaigns that questioned their professional competence. The family's influence extended beyond the educational sphere into law enforcement and local government. Elena's discreet inquiries had revealed that Tyler had been involved in at least 3 incidents that should have resulted in criminal charges: a hit-and-run accident in the school parking lot, vandalism at a rival school during an away game, and an assault on a student from a neighboring district during a house party. In each case, the charges had been dropped or reduced to minor infractions after James Bennett's attorney became involved, often accompanied by financial settlements that ensured the victim's silence. Elena's military background had taught her to recognize the structure of corruption and the way it insulated powerful individuals from accountability. What she was seeing at Riverside High was a textbook example of how institutional capture worked. The Bennett family had systematically invested in relationships and leverage that made challenging their son's behavior professionally and politically dangerous for anyone in a position of authority. Teachers feared for their careers, administrators worried about their budgets, and law enforcement officers understood that pursuing Tyler aggressively could affect their department's relationship with one of the community's most influential families. But Elena had also learned that every system of protection had vulnerabilities, and every seemingly untouchable individual had blind spots that could be exploited by someone with the right knowledge and patience. Tyler's confidence in his immunity had made him careless. His assumption that adults would always intervene on his behalf had led him to take increasingly brazen risks. He'd grown accustomed to operating without real opposition, surrounded by people who either actively supported his behavior or were too intimidated to challenge it effectively. The intelligence Elena gathered extended beyond Tyler's immediate circle to encompass the broader ecosystem that enabled his behavior. She identified students who'd been targeted by the group but were afraid to come forward, teachers who privately expressed frustration with the administration's failure to address discipline issues, and parents who'd withdrawn their children from Riverside rather than continue fighting a system that seemed designed to protect bullies rather than victims. Most importantly, Elena began to understand the rhythm and patterns of Tyler's operations. The group tended to escalate their activities during periods of high stress, using harassment as a way to maintain control when their dominance was challenged by academic or athletic pressures. They preferred public humiliation to private confrontation, understanding that an audience amplified the psychological impact of their attacks while also providing social proof of their power. And they always targeted students who lacked the social connections or family resources necessary to fight back effectively. As Elena completed her reconnaissance and analysis, she began to formulate a strategy for confronting the network of abuse and enablement that had taken root at Riverside High. She understood that direct confrontation would be futile as Tyler enjoyed institutional protection, but she also recognized that protection had limits when it came into conflict with legal liability and public accountability. The key was creating circumstances where the adults who enabled Tyler's behavior would face consequences that outweighed their investment in maintaining the status quo. The plan that began to form in Elena's mind drew on every aspect of her military and corporate security experience. She would need to document everything, build airtight cases that couldn't be dismissed or minimized, and create pressure from multiple directions that would overwhelm the Bennett family's ability to manage the situation through their usual channels. Most importantly, she would need to be prepared for the inevitable escalation that would come when Tyler realized that his traditional tactics weren't working against her. Elena's discovery phase had revealed the true scope of the challenge she faced, but it had also identified the tools and opportunities she would need to dismantle the system of abuse that had been allowed to flourish at Riverside High. Tyler. Bennett and his enablers had built their power on the assumption that no one would be willing or able to challenge them effectively. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption could be when it encountered someone who understood power better than they did and wasn't afraid to use that understanding in service of justice. Part 3. First Encounter. The first direct confrontation between Elena and Tyler occurred on a Tuesday morning in late September, during the brief window between homeroom announcements and first period when students moved through the hallways with purposeful urgency. Elena had been walking from her office to the main guidance suite, carrying a stack of academic transcripts that needed review when she rounded the corner near the trophy display case and nearly collided with a cluster of students gathered around, something that was generating excited whispers and nervous laughter. At the center of the commotion stood Amy Walsh, a quiet sophomore whose artistic talents had earned her recognition in several regional competitions, but whose introverted personality made her a natural target for students who interpreted difference as weakness. Amy clutched her sketchbook against her chest while tears streamed down her face, her usually neat brown hair disheveled and her art supplies scattered across the polished linoleum floor. The source of her distress became immediately apparent when Elena noticed the dark stains covering Amy's white sweater and the empty chocolate milk carton lying nearby. Tyler Bennett stood directly in front of Amy, his 6'2" frame creating an intimidating presence that was amplified by the semicircle of followers who flanked him on either side. Marcus Rivera held his phone at the perfect angle to capture Amy's humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability about the recording, his expression one of barely contained amusement at the scene unfolding before him. Jackson Hayes provided commentary for the benefit of their growing audience, his voice pitched to carry just far enough to ensure that nearby students could hear his observations about Amy's appearance and social status. Madison Cole and Kaylee. Ross completed the circle, their perfectly styled appearances creating a stark contrast to Amy's obvious distress. Madison's manicured hand rested on Tyler's arm in a gesture that marked him as her territory, while simultaneously signaling her approval of whatever was taking place. Kaylee whispered something to a nearby group of freshmen, her words sparking fresh waves of giggling that added to Amy's mortification. Elena assessed the situation with the rapid threat evaluation skills she'd honed during her military service, immediately recognizing the dynamics at play and the potential for escalation. The gathered students formed a loose perimeter around the central conflict, their body language indicating both fascination with the drama and anxiety about their own safety. Several younger students pressed themselves against the lockers, clearly wanting to escape but afraid that movement might draw unwanted attention to themselves. A few older students watched with expressions of discomfort, but none showed any inclination to intervene on Amy's behalf. The positioning was deliberate and strategic. Tyler had cornered Amy near the intersection of two major hallways, ensuring maximum visibility for whatever humiliation he was orchestrating, while also cutting off her potential escape routes. The timing was equally calculated, occurring during the brief period when hallway supervision was minimal and most faculty members were focused on preparing for their first period classes. Elena moved closer, her training allowing her to observe details that others might miss. Amy's art supplies hadn't been randomly scattered. They'd been deliberately thrown in a pattern that suggested systematic destruction rather than accidental spillage. The chocolate milk stains on her sweater formed a concentrated area around her chest and stomach, indicating that the liquid had been poured rather than accidentally spilled. Most tellingly, Tyler's shoes showed traces of pastel chalk and charcoal, evidence that he deliberately stepped on Amy's artistic materials. Maybe next time you'll think twice before entering competitions you're not qualified for, Tyler was saying, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that came from years of unchallenged dominance. Some of us have worked our whole lives to represent this school properly, and we don't appreciate wannabes trying to steal opportunities they haven't earned. Amy's voice was barely audible when she responded, her words coming in broken fragments between quiet sobs. I just wanted to draw. I wasn't trying to take anything from anyone. I just wanted to share my art. Marcus adjusted his phone angle to better capture Amy's tears, while Jackson provided additional commentary about the importance of knowing one's place in the social hierarchy. Madison's grip on Tyler's arm tightened slightly, a signal that she approved of his handling of the situation and wanted him to continue pressing his advantage. Your art? Tyler's laugh was sharp and cruel, designed to cut rather than express genuine amusement. You mean those amateur sketches you think are worth hanging in the display case? Real artists don't need participation trophies from small-town competitions. They earn recognition through actual talent and hard work. The crowd's reaction was immediate and predictable. Several students laughed on cue, their responses conditioned by months or years of witnessing similar performances. Others shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent, understanding that any show of sympathy for Amy might redirect Tyler's attention toward them. A few pulled out their own phones, adding to the documentation of Amy's humiliation while ensuring they had content to share across their social media networks. Elena had seen enough. She stepped forward with the kind of measured movement that commanded attention without appearing aggressive, her presence immediately altering the dynamics of the situation. The crowd's energy shifted as students recognized her authority, though Tyler and his inner circle seemed oblivious to the change in atmosphere. Is there a problem here? Elena's voice carried the calm authority she'd perfected during her military service, neither aggressive nor submissive, but unmistakably in command. She positioned herself at an angle that allowed her to observe all the participants while also blocking Marcus's phone camera, a strategic choice that disrupted the group's ability to document whatever came next. Tyler turned toward her with the kind of practiced smile he'd perfected for adults, his expression shifting seamlessly from cruel amusement to respectful concern. No problem at all, Dr. Martinez. Just helping a fellow student understand some important life lessons about preparation and effort. Elena's trained eye caught details that Tyler's performance couldn't conceal. The slight tension in his shoulders indicated readiness for potential conflict. while his positioning relative to Amy suggested he was prepared to escalate the situation if challenged. Marcus had lowered his phone but hadn't put it away, keeping his recording device ready for immediate use. Jackson and the girls had shifted into supportive formation, prepared to provide backup through verbal intervention or social pressure. "I see," Elena replied, her tone giving nothing away while she conducted her own assessment of the scene. She noticed how other students had begun to disperse now that adult authority was present, though several lingered within earshot to observe how the confrontation would resolve. "Amy, are you injured?" Amy's response came in whispered fragments, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the hallway. "No, ma'am. I'm okay. It was just an accident." Elena recognized the fear behind Amy's words, understanding that the girl was trapped between Tyler's immediate threat and the long-term consequences of reporting his behavior to authority figures who might not provide effective protection. This was exactly the kind of situation that had allowed Tyler to operate with impunity for so long. Victims who were too intimidated to seek help, and witnesses who understood that speaking up could make them the next target. "Accidents happen," Tyler said smoothly, his tone suggesting generous forgiveness for Amy's clumsiness. "I was just explaining to Amy that she might want to be more careful with her belongings in the future. These hallways can be dangerous for students who don't pay attention to their surroundings." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in language that provided plausible deniability while making Tyler's meaning perfectly clear to everyone present. Elena recognized the technique from her study of insurgent communication methods, where threats and intimidation were often couched in seemingly innocent language that allowed the speaker to claim misunderstanding if challenged directly. Elena bent down to help Amy gather her scattered art supplies, a gesture that served multiple purposes. It demonstrated support for the victim while also allowing her to examine the evidence of deliberate destruction more closely. The charcoal sticks had been broken systematically, the colored pencils showed signs of being stepped on repeatedly, and several of Amy's drawings had been deliberately torn. This wasn't the result of an accident or even a momentary loss of control. It was the product of calculated cruelty designed to maximize psychological damage. "Your drawings are quite impressive," Elena said to Amy as she handed back a partially damaged sketch, speaking loudly enough for the remaining audience to hear. "I understand you've won several regional competitions. The school should be proud to have such talented students representing us." Tyler's expression hardened slightly at Elena's words, though he maintained his public persona of respectful cooperation. Marcus shifted position to get a better angle with his phone, while Madison's grip on Tyler's arm tightened in a signal that she was growing impatient with the extended interaction. "We're all proud of students who work hard and earn their achievements," Tyler replied, his emphasis on earn designed to undermine Elena's praise while maintaining his image as a supportive peer. Competition teaches valuable lessons about preparation and realistic expectations. Elena straightened to her full height, positioning herself at an angle that blocked Tyler's direct access to Amy, while also sending a clear message about protective intent. Her military training had taught her the importance of nonverbal communication in establishing dominance and control, and she used those skills now to subtly shift the power dynamic of the encounter. "Indeed it does," Elena agreed, her tone remaining neutral while her eyes met Tyler's directly. "Competition also teaches us about sportsmanship, respect for opponents, and gracious acceptance of others' success. These are particularly important lessons for students in leadership positions who serve as role models for their peers." The hallway had grown quieter as word spread about the confrontation between the new vice principal and Tyler Bennett. Students who had moved on to their classes found excuses to return, while others emerged from nearby classrooms to witness what many sensed could be a significant moment in Riverside's social dynamics. Elena was aware of the growing audience, but didn't allow it to influence her approach. She'd learned long ago that backing down from confrontation only encouraged further aggression. Tyler's response came after a carefully calculated pause, his smile never wavering, even as his eyes showed the first signs of genuine annoyance. "Of course, Dr. Martinez. Leadership is something I take very seriously, especially my responsibility to help younger students understand the importance of working within their capabilities and contributing positively to our school community." Elena recognized the subtle challenge in Tyler's words, the way he'd positioned himself as a leader and authority figure while casting doubt on Amy's contributions to the school. This was exactly the kind of sophisticated manipulation that had allowed him to operate with impunity for so long, using language that sounded reasonable on the surface while delivering unmistakable threats to anyone who understood the subtext. "I'm glad to hear that," Elena replied, her tone still neutral, but with an edge that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by Tyler's performance. True leadership involves protecting those who are vulnerable and ensuring that all students feel safe and supported in their educational environment. I trust you understand the importance of those responsibilities. The tension in the hallway was palpable now, as students recognized that they were witnessing more than just a routine administrative intervention. Elena and Tyler were engaged in a careful dance of dominance and submission, each testing the other's boundaries while maintaining the facade of civil discourse. The outcome would likely determine how similar situations were handled in the future. Marcus finally put away his phone, recognizing that the continued presence of adult authority had made further recording inadvisable. Jackson and the girls began, showing signs of restlessness, their body language indicating that they were ready to move on to more profitable activities. But Tyler remained focused on Elena, his expression suggesting that he was genuinely surprised by her willingness to challenge him directly. "Absolutely," Tyler said, his voice maintaining its respectful tone while his posture subtly shifted to a more aggressive stance. "I believe in protecting students, especially from situations that might be beyond their ability to handle successfully. Sometimes that means having difficult conversations about realistic expectations and appropriate boundaries." Elena understood that Tyler was describing exactly what he'd been doing to Amy, but framing it as protective guidance rather than systematic intimidation. She'd encountered similar rhetorical tactics during her military service, where hostile actors often justified aggressive behavior as defensive or educational. The key to responding effectively was refusing to accept the aggressor's framing while maintaining enough professionalism to avoid providing ammunition for future retaliation. "I appreciate your concern for student welfare," Elena replied, her words carefully chosen to avoid giving Tyler any opening for further manipulation. "Of course, ensuring student safety and well-being is primarily the responsibility of faculty and administration. We have professional training and institutional authority that allows us to make those determinations appropriately." Tyler's smile flickered for just a moment, the first crack in his carefully maintained facade. Elena's words had essentially told him to stay in his lane, asserting her authority while simultaneously questioning his right to protect other students through intimidation and harassment. It was a direct challenge delivered in language that was impossible to criticize, without revealing his true intentions. "Of course," Tyler agreed, though his tone had cooled noticeably. "I would never want to overstep my boundaries or interfere with official school policies. I'm just trying to be a positive influence on my fellow students." Elena nodded, as if accepting his explanation at face value, though her expression suggested She understood exactly what kind of influence Tyler had been exerting. "I'm sure you are, and I'm equally sure that as we work together this year, we'll find many opportunities to discuss what positive influence looks like in practice." The warning was subtle, but unmistakable. Elena was putting Tyler on notice that his behavior would be monitored and that future incidents would be viewed through the lens of their current conversation. She was also establishing herself as someone who wouldn't be intimidated or manipulated through the usual channels that Tyler relied on to neutralize adult opposition. Tyler's inner circle had begun to shift restlessly, recognizing that their leader wasn't achieving the kind of quick victory they were accustomed to seeing when adults attempted to challenge their behavior. Madison's expression showed the first signs of genuine concern, while Marcus and Jackson exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering their approach to the new vice principal. "I look forward to those conversations," Tyler replied, his tone maintaining its surface politeness, while his eyes conveyed a very different message. "I think you'll find that I'm always eager to learn and grow as a leader in our school community." Elena recognized the implicit threat in Tyler's words. He was telling her that their conflict was far from over and that he intended to test her resolve through whatever means necessary. But she'd faced more dangerous opponents than entitled teenagers, and she understood that showing any sign of intimidation would only encourage further escalation. "Excellent," Elena said, her tone suggesting genuine pleasure at the prospect. "I believe that growth often comes through challenge, and I'm confident that this year will provide many opportunities for all of us to learn important lessons about leadership, responsibility, and accountability." With that, Elena turned to Amy, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes and growing amazement. No adult had ever stood up to Tyler Bennett on her behalf, and she seemed unsure how to process what she'd just witnessed. "Amy, why don't you come with me to the office? We can get you a clean shirt from the nurse's emergency supply, and I'd like to hear more about your art competitions." Elena's invitation was delivered in a tone that made it clear this wasn't a request, effectively removing Amy from Tyler's sphere of influence, while also demonstrating that the girl had adult protection and support. As Elena and Amy walked away, Elena could feel Tyler's gaze following them down the hallway. She'd won this round, but she knew it was only the beginning of what would likely be a prolonged conflict. Tyler Bennett wasn't accustomed to losing, and he certainly wasn't going to accept defeat from a new administrator who didn't understand how things worked at Riverside High. The first encounter had established the battle lines and revealed each side's initial strategy. Elena had demonstrated that she wouldn't be intimidated or manipulated through Tyler's usual tactics, while Tyler had shown that he was willing to test her resolve through increasingly direct challenges. The next phase of their conflict would determine whether Elena could maintain her position of strength or whether Tyler's institutional advantages would ultimately overwhelm her resistance. Part 4. Finding ground. Elena's office became an unlikely sanctuary in the weeks following. Her hallway confrontation with Tyler Bennett. Students who had never felt safe enough to report harassment began appearing at her door during lunch periods and free study halls. Their stories painting a comprehensive picture of systematic intimidation that had flourished unchecked for years. Amy Walsh was the first to return, clutching a portfolio of her artwork and speaking in halting sentences about months of torment that had escalated after her regional competition victory. The transformation in Amy during their private conversations revealed both the depth of damage Tyler's campaign had inflicted and the resilience that had kept her functioning despite constant psychological assault. Elena learned that the chocolate milk incident had been just the latest in a series of calculated attacks designed to undermine Amy's confidence and isolate her from potential supporters. Her art supplies had been vandalized repeatedly, Her locker had been broken into and filled with garbage, and her few friendships had been systematically poisoned through rumor campaigns that portrayed her as arrogant and attention-seeking. But Amy's story also revealed something else: the existence of other students who had witnessed her harassment and wanted to help, but felt powerless to intervene without becoming targets themselves. Elena began reaching out to these potential allies, using her administrative authority to create opportunities for private conversations that couldn't be monitored or disrupted by Tyler's network of informants. David Kim proved to be one of Elena's most valuable sources of information about Tyler's operations. As a freshman who had been targeted early in the school year, David had developed sophisticated survival strategies that included detailed documentation of incidents and careful mapping of Tyler's behavioral patterns. During their meetings, David shared a notebook filled with dates, times, and descriptions of harassment incidents that painted a clear picture of escalation and systematic planning. Elena was particularly struck by David's analytical approach to his own victimization. Rather than simply enduring the abuse, he had studied it with the kind of methodical attention that reminded her of intelligence analysis. David had identified Tyler's preferred targets, mapped the social networks that enabled his behavior, and even predicted with remarkable accuracy when attacks were likely to occur based on external stresses like academic pressure or athletic performance. He doesn't just pick on people randomly, David explained during one of their afternoon meetings, his voice gaining confidence as he shared insights that no adult had ever taken seriously before. There's always a pattern. He targets students who achieve something he thinks belongs to him, or people who represent things he feels threatened by. Amy won that art competition during the same week Tyler got a C- on his creative writing assignment. Sarah Chen was named valedictorian, right after Tyler found out his SAT scores weren't high enough for his first-choice college. Elena encouraged David to continue documenting Tyler's behavior while also working to connect him with other students who had been targeted. What emerged was an informal network of victims and witnesses who had been isolated by Tyler's divide-and-conquer tactics, but possessed collectively powerful evidence of systematic abuse. Sarah Chen, the valedictorian whose academic achievement had triggered one of Tyler's most vicious campaigns, brought a different perspective to Elena's growing understanding of the situation. Unlike Amy and David, Sarah came from a family with significant resources and social connections, but even those advantages hadn't protected her from Tyler's retaliation. The attack on her reputation had been so sophisticated and coordinated that it had required intervention from her parents' attorney to prevent permanent damage to her college prospects. The scary thing isn't just what Tyler does, Sarah explained during a meeting in Elena's office, her usual composed demeanor cracking slightly as she recalled the worst periods of harassment. It's how the whole system supports him. Teachers who saw evidence of what was happening chose to look the other way. Students who could have spoken up decided it was safer to stay silent. Even parents who complained were told that teenage drama was normal and that their children needed to develop thicker skin. Sarah's perspective helped Elena understand that Tyler's power extended far beyond his immediate circle of followers. He had successfully created an environment where resistance seemed futile and collaboration appeared to be the only safe option. Students learned to anticipate his reactions and modify their behavior to avoid triggering his attention, while adults found excuses to avoid confronting behavior they knew was wrong but felt powerless to address effectively. But Elena also began to identify cracks in Tyler's seemingly impregnable position. During her meetings with targeted students, she learned about incidents where Tyler's tactics had backfired or where potential victims had successfully resisted his intimidation attempts. These stories revealed that Tyler's confidence was built on carefully maintained illusions of invincibility that could be shattered by the right kind of opposition. Emma Rodriguez, a junior who had successfully defended herself against one of Madison Cole's social media campaigns, provided Elena with crucial insights into the group's operational methods. Emma had been targeted after she was selected for a prestigious summer program that Madison had also applied for, triggering a coordinated attack designed to destroy her reputation and force her to withdraw from the opportunity. "They have a whole system," Emma explained, her voice steady despite the obvious trauma of recalling the experience. Madison creates fake social media accounts to spread rumors and share embarrassing photos. Kaylee works the social networks to isolate targets from their friend groups. Marcus documents everything for blackmail purposes, and Jackson uses his follow account to amplify whatever narrative they want to promote. Tyler usually stays above the actual dirty work, but he coordinates everything and provides protection when things go too far. Emma's successful resistance had come through a combination of family support, legal intervention, and her own refusal to be intimidated into silence. Her parents had hired a cybersecurity expert to trace the source of the fake accounts. Her attorney had sent cease and desist letters that threatened serious legal consequences, and Emma herself had refused to modify her behavior or withdraw from activities despite the ongoing harassment. "The thing that surprised me most," Emma continued, "was how quickly they backed down once they realized I was willing to fight back. Tyler's whole power structure depends on people being too scared or isolated to resist effectively. When someone shows they're not afraid and they have resources to fight back, the group usually moves on to easier targets." Elena filed away Emma's insights while also recognizing the troubling implications of her analysis. Tyler's victims were essentially being selected based on their perceived vulnerability and inability to resist effectively. Students from families without resources, those who lacked strong social connections, and anyone whose personality or circumstances made them unlikely to fight back were being systematically targeted for abuse. This realization led Elena to begin identifying students who might be at risk but hadn't yet been targeted. She used her administrative access to academic and disciplinary records to compile profiles of potentially vulnerable students, then began creating opportunities for preventive intervention that could strengthen their defenses before Tyler identified them as opportunities. The process of building alliances among Tyler's victims and potential targets required careful coordination to avoid alerting him to what was happening. Elena scheduled meetings during times when Tyler and his friends were occupied with athletics or other activities, used her office's private entrance to ensure students could meet with her without being observed, and developed communication systems that couldn't be easily monitored or disrupted. Ms. Sarah Kim, the English teacher who had shown signs of frustration with the administration's failure to address discipline issues, became Elena's first faculty ally. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter as Elena Martinez stood at her office window, watching the daily choreography of teenage social dynamics play out in the courtyard below. 3 weeks had passed since her hallway confrontation. With Tyler Bennett, and the subtle shifts in power were becoming increasingly apparent to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Students who had once automatically deferred to Tyler's group now showed flickers of resistance, small moments of defiance that suggested the carefully maintained order of Riverside High was beginning to fracture. Elena had spent those weeks building her network of allies while carefully documenting every incident that crossed her desk. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of systematic escalation as Tyler tested the boundaries of his new reality. Unable to intimidate Elena through his usual tactics, he had begun targeting students who showed any sign of connection to her, creating a climate of fear designed to isolate her from potential supporters. The morning brought news that would force Elena's hand in ways she hadn't anticipated. Ms. Sarah Kim appeared at her office door during the brief window between homeroom and first period. Her usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled anger and what appeared to be genuine fear. Sarah clutched a manila folder against her chest while tears of frustration gathered in her eyes, her professional facade cracking under the weight of whatever had driven her to seek Elena's help. "They've gone too far this time," Sarah said, without preamble, her voice shaking with emotion that had been building for weeks. "I can't pretend this is normal teenage behavior anymore. I can't keep making excuses for what they're doing to these kids." Elena gestured for Sarah to sit while closing her office door and activating the privacy settings that would prevent their conversation from being overheard or interrupted. Sarah's distress was genuine and immediate, suggesting that whatever had happened represented a significant escalation from Tyler's previous activities. "Tell me what happened," Elena said, settling into the chair across from Sarah with the kind of focused attention that encouraged complete disclosure. Her military training had taught her the importance of creating safe spaces for witnesses to share information without fear of judgment or retaliation. Sarah opened the manila folder with trembling hands, revealing a collection of printed screenshots, social media posts, and what appeared to be surveillance photos that had been taken without the subject's knowledge or consent. The images showed various students in compromising or embarrassing situations, some clearly manipulated, but others disturbingly authentic. "They call it the gallery," Sarah explained, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if speaking the words too loudly might summon Tyler's attention. "It's a private social media group where they collect and share humiliating content about other students. Photos taken in locker rooms, manipulated images that make innocent interactions look sexual, private conversations that were recorded without consent. They use it for blackmail and entertainment." Elena examined the evidence with the methodical attention she'd learned during her intelligence analysis training, noting details that revealed the sophistication and coordination behind the operation. The photos weren't random snapshots, but carefully planned surveillance, taken from angles that suggested the photographers had positioned themselves specifically to capture compromising moments. The manipulated images showed professional-level editing skills, with faces seamlessly grafted onto inappropriate bodies in ways that would convince casual observers of their authenticity. "How did you get access to this?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from Sarah's expression of guilt and determination. "One of my students came to me yesterday afternoon," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength as she moved into educator mode. "Jessica Martinez, a sophomore in my honors English class. She's been Tyler's target for the past month because she had the audacity to challenge one of his interpretations during a class discussion. Yesterday, someone slipped a printed copy of one of these images into her locker, along with a note saying this was just the beginning if she didn't learn to keep her mouth shut." Elena studied the image Sarah indicated, feeling her own anger rise as she recognized the deliberate cruelty behind its creation. Jessica's face had been grafted onto the body of someone in a compromising position, the editing skillful enough to convince anyone who didn't look closely that the image was authentic. More disturbing was the accompanying text that suggested the image was being shared throughout the school's social media networks. Jessica was terrified, Sarah continued, her educator's protective instincts clearly outweighing her concerns about potential retaliation. She begged me not to report it because she was afraid it would make things worse. But when I told her I couldn't ignore evidence of this kind of systematic harassment, she broke down and showed me what else they've been doing. Sarah produced a tablet from her bag, its screen showing a private Instagram account that Elena realized must be the hub of Tyler's blackmail operation. The account, creatively named Riverside Reality Check, contained dozens of posts featuring students in embarrassing or compromising situations, each accompanied by captions that revealed personal information or private struggles that had been weaponized for public humiliation. Elena scrolled through the content with growing disgust and professional fascination. This wasn't random teenage cruelty, but a sophisticated psychological warfare operation designed to maintain social control through fear and intimidation. The posts were organized thematically, with different categories for academic failures, social awkwardness, family problems, and perceived character flaws. Comment sections revealed a network of followers who competed to add their own cruel observations and suggestions for future content. How many people have access to this account? Elena asked, though she was already developing strategies for tracking the operation's scope and identifying all participants. Jessica thinks there are at least 50 active followers, plus, however, many people they share content with through private messages, Sarah replied. The really scary part is how they gather information. They have people in every social group, every club, every activity. Students who don't even realize they're being used as sources of intelligence about their peers. Elena recognized the structure Sarah was describing from her military experience with insurgent networks. Tyler had essentially created a counterintelligence operation within Riverside High, using social relationships and casual conversations to gather compromising information that could be weaponized when necessary. The sophistication suggested planning and coordination that went far beyond typical teenage social media drama. "Have you shared this with Principal Chen?" Elena asked, though she suspected she knew what Sarah's response would be. Sarah's expression darkened with frustration and disappointment that clearly had been building for months. "I tried to schedule a meeting yesterday afternoon, but his secretary said he was too busy with budget meetings to discuss minor disciplinary issues. When I insisted it was urgent, she suggested I handle it through normal channels and submit a written report that could be reviewed when time permitted." Elena wasn't surprised by Chen's avoidance, but the timing of his unavailability suggested that word of Jessica's discovery had already reached someone with the influence to ensure administrative interference was minimized. The Bennett family's network of protection was more extensive and responsive than she'd initially realized. "What about other faculty members?" Elena pressed, though she was beginning to understand why Sarah had come to her rather than working through established channels. "I've tried talking to other teachers, but most are either too scared to get involved or genuinely believe this is just normal teenage behavior that will resolve itself," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd fought unsuccessfully for systemic change. "Coach Williams actually told me that boys will be boys and that social media drama was outside his area of responsibility. Mrs. Henderson suggested that if students were being targeted, they should consider whether their own behavior might be contributing to the problem." Elena felt her own anger building as she recognized the systematic failure of adult responsibility that had allowed Tyler's operation to flourish unchecked. Every institution that should have protected students was instead finding excuses to avoid confronting behavior that was clearly abusive and potentially criminal. "Sarah," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority that had once been used to coordinate military operations, "I need you to understand that what you've shown me represents evidence of multiple felonies: cyberbullying, harassment, invasion of privacy, creation and distribution of manipulated sexual images of minors. This isn't school discipline issue anymore. This is criminal behavior that requires law enforcement intervention." Sarah nodded slowly, though her expression showed the fear that Elena knew was driving her reluctance to escalate the situation further. "I know you're right, but Jessica is terrified that reporting this will make her an even bigger target. She's already talking about transferring schools because she can't handle the stress of wondering when the next attack will come. Elena understood Jessica's fear, but she also recognized that allowing Tyler's operation to continue would only encourage further escalation and create additional victims. The evidence Sarah had provided represented an opportunity to expose the full scope of Tyler's activities in ways that even his family's influence couldn't minimize or dismiss. "Here's what we're going to do," Elena said, shifting into the operational planning mode that had served her well during complex military and corporate crises. "First, I'm going to secure this evidence and create multiple backup copies that can't be tampered with or destroyed. Second, I'm going to document everything according to law enforcement standards so that it can be used in potential criminal proceedings. Third, I'm going to contact our school resource officer and provide him with a comprehensive briefing about what we've discovered." Sarah's relief was visible, though Elena could see that she was still worried about potential consequences for herself and her students. What about Jessica? How do we protect her from retaliation when Tyler realizes his operation has been exposed? Elena had been considering that question since Sarah first showed her the evidence. Tyler's response to having his blackmail network exposed would likely be swift and vicious, particularly toward anyone he perceived as responsible for its discovery. Jessica would need protection that went beyond what the school could provide through normal disciplinary channels. "Jessica's parents need to be informed immediately," Elena replied. "They have a right to know their daughter is being targeted by what amounts to a criminal harassment network, and they need to be prepared to take legal action if necessary. I'm also going to recommend that they document everything with local law enforcement to create an official record that can be used to support restraining orders or other protective measures." Elena paused, considering the broader implications of the evidence before them. Tyler's blackmail operation represented exactly the kind of escalation she'd been expecting, but its sophistication and scope exceeded even her pessimistic projections. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was systematic psychological warfare designed to maintain social control through fear. "There's something else we need to consider," Elena continued, her voice taking on the gravity that the situation demanded. "Tyler didn't create this operation overnight, and he didn't develop these capabilities on his own. Someone taught him these techniques, provided him with the technical skills and strategic planning necessary to build something this sophisticated. We're not just dealing with an entitled teenager acting out. We're dealing with someone who's been trained in psychological manipulation and social control." Sarah's eyes widened as the implications of Elena's analysis became clear. "You think his parents are involved?" Elena had been researching the Bennett family's background since her first week at Riverside, using her security clearance and professional contacts to access information that wasn't available through normal channels. What she'd discovered suggested that James Bennett's business success was built on more than just construction contracts and political connections. James Bennett served in military intelligence before transitioning to the private sector. Elena explained, sharing information that she'd verified through multiple sources. His company doesn't just build residential developments. They specialize in security consulting for corporate clients who need protection from competitive intelligence operations. The techniques Tyler is using aren't things he learned from social media tutorials. They're sophisticated psychological warfare tactics that require training and experience to implement effectively. Sarah absorbed this information with growing alarm, understanding that Tyler's protection extended far beyond family wealth and political influence. If his father had taught him these techniques as part of his preparation for eventually joining the family business, then Tyler's harassment campaigns weren't just teenage cruelty, but practice sessions for more serious operations he might conduct. As an adult, Elena's phone buzzed with an incoming text message that immediately captured her attention. The message was from an unknown number, but its content made its source unmistakably clear. Stop interfering with things you don't understand, or learn what real consequences look like. Elena showed the message to Sarah, whose face paled as she realized that Tyler had somehow learned about their meeting and was already beginning his counterattack. How could he know we were discussing this? I haven't told anyone except you. Elena's security training immediately activated as she considered the possibilities. Tyler's intelligence network was more extensive than they'd realized, or he had access to surveillance capabilities that went beyond typical teenage social media monitoring. Either way, their conversation had been compromised, and Tyler was already moving to neutralize the threat they represented. We need to assume that Tyler has been monitoring our communications and possibly our movements, Elena said, shifting into the threat assessment mode that had kept her alive in far more dangerous environments. From this point forward, all conversations about this situation need to happen in secure locations with proper counter-surveillance measures. Elena's military training had included extensive education about operational security and the techniques used to gather intelligence in hostile environments. Tyler's message suggested that he was applying similar principles to maintain awareness of potential threats to his operation, which meant that Elena would need to use her own professional skills to stay ahead of his intelligence gathering. Sarah, I need you to go back to your classroom and continue your normal routine as if nothing has changed, Elena instructed, already formulating a comprehensive response strategy. Don't discuss this situation with anyone. Don't modify your behavior in ways that might alert Tyler's network, and don't attempt to contact Jessica or her parents until I've had a chance to establish secure communication protocols. Sarah nodded, though her expression showed the strain of being thrust into a situation that had escalated far beyond typical educational challenges. What are you going to do? Elena stood and moved to her office safe, retrieving a secure communications device that she'd hoped never to need in an educational environment. I'm going to call in some favors from my previous career and ensure that Tyler Bennett's criminal enterprise gets the kind of professional attention it deserves. This stopped being a school discipline issue the moment he threatened a faculty member. As Sarah left Elena's office, both women understood that they had crossed a line that would make retreat impossible. Tyler Bennett's blackmail operation represented a clear and present danger to student safety that could no longer be addressed through normal administrative channels. Elena had spent weeks trying to work within the system, but Tyler's escalation had forced her to acknowledge that the system itself was compromised. Elena secured the evidence Sarah had provided while simultaneously activating communication protocols that would allow her to coordinate with law enforcement and security professionals who possessed the skills and authority necessary to dismantle Tyler's operation. The confrontation she'd been preparing for since her arrival at Riverside High was about to begin in earnest, and she intended to ensure that Tyler Bennett learned exactly what happened when entitled teenagers tried to intimidate people who'd faced real enemies in real wars. The message on Elena's phone represented Tyler's declaration of war, but it also provided her with the justification she needed to respond with the full range of professional capabilities she'd spent years developing. Tyler had built his power on the assumption that no one would be willing or able to challenge him effectively, but he was about to discover that Dr. Elena Martinez wasn't just another administrator who could be neutralized through intimidation and institutional pressure. The battle lines had been drawn, and Elena intended to win. The morning of October 24th dawned with an unseasonable warmth that felt ominous against the backdrop of homecoming week festivities. Elena Martinez arrived at Riverside High 30, Minutes earlier than usual, her practiced eye immediately noting the subtle changes in campus atmosphere that indicated something significant was about to unfold. Students moved with an energy that went beyond typical pre-weekend excitement, their conversations carrying undercurrents of anticipation and nervous tension that suggested word of impending drama had spread through the school's social networks. Overnight, Elena had spent the previous evening coordinating with law enforcement contacts from her military and corporate security background, building a comprehensive case file that documented Tyler Bennett's criminal harassment network with the kind of methodical precision that would satisfy federal prosecutors. Detective Maria Santos of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation had agreed to review the evidence, her expertise in cybercrime and juvenile justice making her the ideal liaison for what Elena suspected would become a complex, multi-jurisdictional investigation. But Elena also understood that Tyler wouldn't wait passively for law enforcement procedures to unfold. His threatening text message had been followed by a series of increasingly aggressive probes designed to test her resolve and identify vulnerabilities in her defenses. Her apartment building's security cameras had captured suspicious vehicles conducting surveillance. Her personal social media accounts had been subjected to sophisticated hacking attempts, and several of her known associates had received anonymous messages warning them about the consequences of supporting her investigation. The escalation confirmed Elena's assessment that Tyler's capabilities extended far beyond typical teenage harassment tactics. Someone with professional training in intelligence gathering and psychological warfare was coordinating his response, likely his father, James Bennett, whose background in military intelligence and corporate security provided him with the skills necessary to mount a sophisticated counteroffensive against perceived threats to his family's interests. Elena's office had become a fortress of sorts, equipped with counter-surveillance devices and secure communication systems that allowed her to coordinate with allies without fear of interception. She'd established protocols with trusted faculty, members, and vulnerable students that would ensure immediate notification if Tyler's network attempted retaliation against anyone connected to her investigation. Most importantly, she'd prepared contingency plans for various escalation scenarios, drawing on her military experience with asymmetric warfare to anticipate Tyler's likely responses and prepare appropriate countermeasures. The morning brought disturbing news that confirmed Elena's fears about Tyler's willingness to escalate beyond conventional boundaries. Amy Walsh's artwork had been vandalized again, but this time the destruction had occurred in her family's garage, suggesting that Tyler's surveillance network had identified her home address and was prepared to extend their harassment campaign beyond school property. David Kim reported that his younger sister had been approached by strangers asking questions about his family's immigration status, a clear attempt to create new pressure points that could be exploited if necessary. Most alarmingly, Jessica Martinez had failed to arrive for first period, and her parents' calls to the school indicated that she'd left for Riverside High at her normal time, but had never arrived. Elena immediately activated emergency protocols while simultaneously contacting Detective Santos to report a potential kidnapping that might be connected to Tyler's retaliation campaign. The search for Jessica led Elena to the school's main courtyard, where a crowd of students had gathered around what appeared to be some kind of public spectacle. Elena's trained instincts immediately recognized the setup as a deliberate provocation, designed to draw her into a confrontation that would occur under Tyler's preferred conditions with maximum audience impact. But Jessica's safety took precedence over tactical considerations, forcing Elena to approach the situation despite understanding that she was likely walking into a carefully prepared trap. Tyler Bennett stood at the center of the courtyard with his usual entourage, but their formation was more organized than Elena had previously observed, suggesting military-style coordination that confirmed her suspicions about professional training. Marcus Rivera held his phone in recording position, while Jackson Hayes managed a secondary camera angle, ensuring that whatever was about to unfold would be documented from multiple perspectives for maximum social media impact. Madison Cole and Kaylee Ross flanked a figure that Elena realized with growing alarm was Jessica Martinez, the sophomore who had provided crucial evidence about Tyler's blackmail operation. Jessica appeared unharmed, but clearly terrified, her eyes darting frantically as she searched for escape routes that Tyler's positioning had systematically eliminated. Elena approached with the measured pace she'd learned during military operations in hostile territory, her senses alert for signs of additional threats while her mind calculated tactical options and potential responses. The crowd of student spectators had formed a loose perimeter around the central confrontation, their phone cameras creating a secondary layer of documentation that would ensure whatever happened next would be permanently preserved and widely distributed. "Dr. Martinez!" Tyler called out as she drew within conversational range, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone who believed he controlled the situation completely. "I'm so glad you could join us for this important educational demonstration about the consequences of interfering with student social dynamics." Elena positioned herself at an angle that allowed her to observe all participants, while also blocking some of the camera angles that Tyler's team had established. Her military training had taught her the importance of controlling information flow during sensitive operations, and she understood that Tyler's documentation strategy was designed to create a narrative that would support his version of events. Regardless of what actually occurred, "Jessica!" Elena called out, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once been used to coordinate evacuations under fire. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Jessica's response came in a trembling whisper that barely carried over the ambient noise of the excited crowd. "I'm okay, Dr. Martinez. They said they just wanted to talk, but they brought me here and won't let me leave." Elena noted the careful phrasing of Jessica's response, recognizing that the girl had been coached about what to say if questioned by authority figures. Tyler's operation was sophisticated enough to include plausible deniability strategies that would protect participants from serious legal consequences, even if their activities were discovered and reported. "That's an interesting interpretation of voluntary participation," Elena replied, her tone remaining conversational while her eyes catalogued potential weapons and escape routes. "Jessica, you're free to leave whenever you choose. No one has the authority to detain you against your will." Tyler's smile widened at Elena's words, suggesting that her response was exactly what he'd been hoping to provoke. "Of course, Jessica is free to leave," he agreed with theatrical magnanimity, "but she might want to hear what we've discovered about certain administrators who abuse their authority to harass innocent students before making any hasty decisions." Elena recognized the setup immediately. Tyler was preparing to reveal information about her background or personal life that he'd gathered through illegal surveillance, hoping to discredit her investigation while simultaneously demonstrating his capability to gather compromising intelligence about anyone who opposed him. The public nature of the confrontation was designed to maximize humiliation, while also creating social media content that would spread far beyond Riverside High's student body. "I'm always interested in accurate information," Elena replied calmly, refusing to show any sign of concern about whatever Tyler thought he'd discovered. "Of course, I'm also interested in ensuring that students aren't subjected to harassment and intimidation tactics that violate both school policy and state criminal statutes." Tyler's confidence flickered slightly at Elena's reference to criminal liability, but he quickly recovered and gestured to Marcus, who began approaching with his phone camera positioned to capture Elena's reaction to whatever revelation was about to be shared. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the confrontation was reaching its climax and eager to witness what many expected to be Tyler's definitive victory over the administrator who had dared to challenge his authority. "Dr. Martinez," Tyler began, his voice projecting far enough to ensure that every spectator could hear his words clearly. "How do you think parents and taxpayers would react if they knew that Riverside High had hired a vice principal with a history of violence and military combat experience? Someone whose previous job involved killing people in foreign countries?" Elena felt a moment of genuine surprise at Tyler's approach. Rather than attacking her with fabricated personal scandals or financial improprieties, he was attempting to weaponize her military service record against her. The strategy showed sophisticated understanding of how public perception could be manipulated, but it also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how communities like Millbrook actually viewed military veterans. "You're referring to my 8 years of service in the United States Air Force Security Forces," Elena replied, her voice carrying pride rather than defensiveness, "during which I had the honor of protecting American military personnel and facilities in some of the world's most dangerous locations. I'm proud of that service, just as I'm proud to now serve the students and families of this community." Tyler's expression showed confusion at Elena's refusal to be ashamed of her military background, but he pressed forward with his planned attack. Service that involved training in hand-to-hand combat, weapons handling, and what military manuals call neutralizing hostile targets. Do parents really want their children supervised by someone who's been trained to kill? Elena realized that Tyler had fundamentally miscalculated both her vulnerabilities and the community's likely response to his revelations. Rather than damaging her credibility, his attack was actually highlighting qualifications that many parents would view as assets in someone responsible for student safety and discipline. "My military training did include defensive tactics and security procedures," Elena confirmed, her tone suggesting that she found Tyler's revelations more amusing than threatening. "Training that's proven quite useful in identifying security threats and protecting vulnerable individuals from harassment and intimidation." The crowd's reaction began to shift as Elena's calm responses undermined Tyler's apparent expectation that his revelations would create shock and outrage. Several students exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to question Tyler's narrative, while others pulled out their phones to research Elena's military background for themselves. Tyler's frustration became more apparent as his planned humiliation failed to achieve its intended effect. "You're missing the point," he said, his voice taking on an edge that suggested his control of the situation was beginning to slip. "The point is that we have a vice principal who thinks she can use military tactics against students who disagree with her policies." Elena recognized that Tyler was attempting to shift from personal attack to professional criticism, but his approach continued to reveal more about his own mindset than hers. "I'm curious about what specific military tactics you think I've employed," she replied, genuinely interested in hearing Tyler's perspective on their previous interactions. Tyler gestured broadly, his confidence returning as he moved into what appeared to be more familiar territory. The surveillance, the interrogations, the attempt to build networks of informants among students. "You've been running an intelligence operation against students who haven't done anything wrong, except refuse to be intimidated by your authority." Elena felt a moment of recognition as Tyler's words revealed the true source of his anger and of frustration. He wasn't upset about her military background or her professional tactics. He was furious that someone had finally applied systematic pressure to his own operations with enough skill and persistence to threaten his position of power. That's an interesting characterization of standard administrative procedures for investigating harassment complaints, Elena replied, her tone suggesting gentle correction rather than confrontation. Though I notice you seem quite familiar with intelligence gathering and surveillance techniques yourself. Where did you learn about those kinds of operations? Tyler's eyes narrowed as he realized that Elena had turned his attack back on him, using his own knowledge of surveillance and intelligence gathering as evidence of more sophisticated capabilities than typical teenagers should possess. The crowd began murmuring as they recognized the implications of Elena's question and started connecting Tyler's accusations to his own demonstrated abilities. "I don't know what you're trying to suggest," Tyler said, but his voice lacked the confidence he'd shown earlier in the confrontation. "I'm just a student who's tired of being harassed by an administrator who doesn't understand how things work at this school." Elena decided it was time to press her advantage and force Tyler into a position where his true nature would be revealed to the watching audience. "How things work," she repeated thoughtfully. "You mean like the private social media account where you collect and share compromising photos of other students? Or the systematic harassment campaigns designed to isolate and intimidate anyone who challenges your authority?" Tyler's reaction was immediate and telling. His face flushed with anger while his body language shifted into a more aggressive posture that confirmed Elena's assessment of his capacity for violence when cornered. "You can't prove any of that," he said, his voice rising enough to carry clearly to the surrounding crowd. "Actually, I can," Elena replied calmly, producing her phone and scrolling to a screenshot of Tyler's Riverside reality check account. "Thanks to evidence provided by concerned students and faculty, I have documentation of criminal harassment, cyberbullying, and creation of manipulated sexual images involving minors, all of which have been forwarded to appropriate law enforcement agencies." The crowd's reaction was immediate and dramatic as students recognized the implications of Elena's revelation. Many pulled out their own phones to search for Tyler's account, while others began whispering about incidents they'd witnessed or experienced personally. Tyler's expression showed genuine panic for the first time as he realized that his supposedly secret operation had been thoroughly compromised. "That's not possible," Tyler stammered, his usual smooth confidence completely evaporating. "Those accounts are private, protected. You can't access them without breaking the law yourself." Elena's smile was genuinely amused as she recognized Tyler's admission that the accounts existed and that he was responsible for them. Private accounts that are used to harass and intimidate other people lose their privacy protections under both school policy and state law, she explained patiently, particularly when the harassment involves minors and potentially criminal activity. Tyler's panic was now visible to everyone in the courtyard as he realized that Elena possessed evidence that could destroy not only his social standing, but potentially his future college and career prospects. His usual support network of followers and enablers began showing signs of wanting to distance themselves from him as the legal implications of their participation became clear. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Tyler said, his voice taking on a desperate edge that revealed how completely his world had been upended by Elena's investigation. "My father has connections, resources. You can't just destroy everything I've worked for based on rumors and lies from jealous students." Elena recognized Tyler's appeal to his family's influence as a final attempt to avoid accountability for his actions. But she also understood that this was the moment when his true character would be revealed to everyone watching. "Your father's "Connections are irrelevant when it comes to criminal behavior," she replied firmly. "No amount of money or political influence can protect you from the consequences of systematically harassing and intimidating your fellow students." Tyler's response was swift and vicious, revealing the capacity for violence that Elena had suspected lay beneath his carefully maintained facade of civilized behavior. He lunged toward her with his hands outstretched, apparently intending to physically assault her in front of hundreds of witnesses while being recorded by dozens of cameras. Elena's military training took over automatically as she recognized the attack and responded with precisely the level of force necessary to protect herself while minimizing harm to Tyler. She sidestepped his clumsy charge and used his own momentum to redirect him toward the ground, where he landed heavily but without serious injury. The entire encounter lasted less than 3 seconds, but every moment was captured by the surrounding cameras. Tyler lay on the concrete courtyard, his designer clothes disheveled and his carefully styled hair completely destroyed, while Elena stood over him with the calm composure of someone who had faced far more dangerous opponents in far more challenging circumstances. The crowd watched in stunned silence as their understanding of power dynamics at Riverside High underwent a fundamental transformation. "Please stay down," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-threatening situations. "Any further aggressive behavior will be met with appropriate defensive force, and I assure you that my training includes techniques far more painful than what you just experienced." Tyler's response came in broken sobs as the full scope of his defeat became apparent to him and everyone watching. His reputation for invincibility had been shattered in front of the entire school. His criminal harassment network had been exposed to law enforcement, and his future prospects had been destroyed by his own actions. But most humiliatingly, he had been physically dominated by the woman he'd tried to intimidate, revealing his fundamental weakness to an audience that would never again view him as untouchable. "Please," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of excited conversation from the surrounding crowd. "Please don't ruin my life. I'll stop everything, delete all the accounts, leave everyone alone. Just please don't press charges." Elena looked down at Tyler's broken form and felt a mixture of satisfaction and genuine sadness. This moment had been inevitable from the first day she'd arrived at Riverside High and recognized the systematic abuse that Tyler's network had been inflicting on vulnerable students. But seeing him reduced to begging for mercy reminded her that he was still a teenager, despite the sophistication of his criminal operations. "Tyler," Elena said softly, her voice carrying the firmness of absolute authority combined with something that might have been compassion. "The choices you made led to this moment. The harassment, the blackmail, the systematic abuse of your fellow students. Those were your decisions, and now you have to live with the consequences." Elena paused, looking around at the crowd of students who were watching this confrontation with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction to genuine amazement. Many of them had been Tyler's victims or had witnessed his abuse of others without feeling able to intervene. This moment represented justice not just for Elena, but for every student who had suffered under Tyler's regime of intimidation and cruelty. "However," Elena continued, her tone suggesting that Tyler's immediate fate wasn't entirely beyond his control, "the severity of those consequences will depend on your choices from this point forward. Full cooperation with law enforcement, genuine accountability for your actions, and a commitment to making amends to the people you've hurt. Those things might influence how this situation develops." Tyler nodded frantically, apparently willing to agree to anything that might reduce the consequences he was facing. But Elena also noticed that his inner circle had begun to disperse, recognizing that their association with Tyler was now a liability rather than an asset. Madison Cole was already walking away from the courtyard while speaking urgently into her phone, likely calling her parents to begin damage control for her own participation in Tyler's operations. Campus security arrived, then followed shortly by local law enforcement officers who had been coordinating with Elena's investigation. Detective Santos appeared among them, her expression professional but satisfied as she surveyed the scene and began coordinating the response to what was clearly a complex criminal case involving multiple juvenile offenders. Elena stepped back and allowed law enforcement to take control of the situation, her role as educator resuming as the immediate threat to student safety had been neutralized. Tyler was helped to his feet and escorted toward the administrative building, where he would begin the process of accounting for months of systematic criminal behavior. His followers were also being identified and separated for individual questioning about their participation in the harassment network. But Elena's attention was drawn to the students who had gathered around her, many of them victims of Tyler's campaigns, who were experiencing their first taste of genuine justice and protection. From adult authority, Amy Walsh stood nearby with tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of relief and gratitude rather than fear and humiliation. David Kim was grinning widely as he recorded video messages for his younger sister, assuring her that the students who had been threatening their family would no longer be a problem. Elena Martinez approached Elena with obvious nervousness, clearly still processing the traumatic morning she'd experienced. "Dr. Martinez," she said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for saving me. When they surrounded me this morning and brought me here, I thought they were going to post something horrible about me and destroy my reputation forever." Elena placed a gentle hand on Jessica's shoulder, recognizing that the girl's trauma would require ongoing support and counseling to process. "Completely. You were very brave to provide the evidence that made this investigation possible," Elena replied. "Without your courage, Tyler would have continued hurting people for months or years to come." As the crowd began to disperse and normal school activities resumed, Elena reflected on the morning's events and their broader implications for Riverside High's culture and future. Tyler Bennett's reign of terror had ended not through administrative procedure or parental intervention, but through the systematic application of professional investigative techniques and the willingness of one adult to prioritize student safety over political convenience. The transformation would take time to complete, as institutional change always did. There would be investigations and legal proceedings, policy reviews and cultural assessments. Some of Tyler's enablers would face consequences, while others would adapt to the new reality and modify their behavior accordingly. Parents and community members would need to reckon with how such systematic abuse had been allowed to flourish under their watch. But the foundation for real change had been established through the demonstration that power based on intimidation and cruelty was ultimately vulnerable to strength grounded in justice and professional competence. Students throughout Riverside High would remember this morning as the day they learned that adults could be trusted to protect them, that bullies could be held accountable for their actions, and that courage in the face of systematic abuse could ultimately triumph over institutional complacency. Elena returned to her office as the final details of Tyler's arrest were being completed, already beginning to plan the support systems and policy changes that would be necessary to ensure that Riverside High never again became a breeding ground for the kind of sophisticated harassment network that Tyler had built. Her military and security background had prepared her for this confrontation, but her commitment to education and student welfare would guide the reconstruction that lay ahead. The war was over, but the real work of building a safe and supportive educational environment was just beginning. Elena Martinez had proven that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the personal and professional risks involved. Now she would prove that victory could be transformed into lasting positive change for the students and families who had entrusted her with their children's safety and future. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.